Well, I'm Dale Wierman, retired from CDF 20 plus years ago. My parents were both products of farming families in Illinois. My mother's parents had immigrated from southern Sweden and married after they arrived in the United States, and she was the third of 6 children. And my father was the firstborn for his parents that were Quakers that descended from early 1600 immigration into Pennsylvania. And as my dad used to say, the wanderless Wiermans continued west. And I was born in Joliet, Illinois, and the first year of their teaching after their graduation from college at Illinois State Normal. The life that I had as a kid was one of being doted upon by all my grandparents, and lots of time playing in the hay lofts, chasing chickens, feeding the hogs, at relatives, my mom's brothers, who were farmers in central Illinois. During the early phase of the Second World War, my father tried to enlist in the Army Air Corps. He was not accepted because of a malformed shoulder, and he ultimately was recruited by DuPont and became one of the many engineers on the Manhattan Project. So early in the war, he received his instructions to move west to Hanford, and he was one of the engineers that was involved in constructing the plutonium works in the 200 West, 200 East, and the other areas within Hanford. He knew what he was doing. I didn't know until I was in college what he had been doing. But during the time living in the West and growing up, we lived on the junction of the Yakima and the Columbia Rivers, and many memories of activities around the sagebrush country that was there then. And every chance we got, we would take trips to the mountains for a picnic, and I became fascinated with just things that went on in the forest and in the sagebrush lands. As I got older and got my own bike, I explored with friends out into the sagebrush country and had many secret hideouts and had early archaeological experience with discovering that there were beads and things in some of these places along the river. And probably Dan Foster would chastise me for some of the digging that we did on those experiences. My father, tired of working in the nuclear industry, and went into business for himself, where he'd been very successful selling life insurance as a part-time person. And we moved to Yakima, Washington. And then our proximity to the forest was much closer, and more time, more weekends, and vacation times on alternate years into the forests. Every other year we would drive back to the Midwest to visit with relatives, and I was deeply embedded in the farming industry of the Midwest. Cow-calf operation, registered cattle and hogs, and it was a fun time. Well, forestry came as kind of a third realization at the third level. After I graduated from high school, it was Yakima High School until my senior year, and then it was Davis High School in Yakima, Washington. And I graduated, and I had played football throughout my years in high school, and I was offered a scholarship without tuition or book fees to the local community college, Yakima Valley College. So I went there for 2 years, and during which time, all the summers after my 7th grade, I worked in the orchards above Yakima. And some of them were, I was kind of a surrogate son to the first family and just lived on their place and get up with the chickens and move sprinklers in the orchard. And I just developed an interest in what was going on with pheasants, quail, and the evolution of farming. But then that, along with going to the Midwest, I soon realized that there was too much repeat in that type of vocation. And though I had lots of experience in farming, both Midwest and orchards and a little bit of sheep in the Pacific Northwest, I just decided that something wasn't there. I ended up taking heavy science load, thinking about possibly medicine, but organic chemistry soured me terribly. And then I went to Washington State. I had decided after the 2 years at the community college that football was great and it was fun, and I had opportunities to go to Montana or other places on scholarship, but I decided that I needed to start preparing for a career, and I knew I didn't want to play sports for a career. And so I went to Washington State, and initially in accounting, and then I discovered that that was not my cup of tea at all. And I had pledged a social fraternity, Phi Gamma Delta, and my big brother was a graduate of the School of Forestry at Washington State University. And so he encouraged me, and meanwhile I had taken a job with the U.S. Forest Service as a seasonal after my junior college time, or before my junior college. I hired on as a lookout. And before I could, the mountain was open to get on top of, into the lookout, I started working on a crew building a trail to this lookout and doing other brush disposal work on the Snoqualmie National Forest. During that time, then there were some lightning storms, and I was asked to take off and find some of these fires to extinguish them. We'd had training, and they were turning me loose to lead people out to find some fires. They were very small, and there was no big deal. They certainly weren't raging. And then I spent the summer of, that was 1960, on Goat Peak Lookout in Snoqualmie National Forest, which is directly east of Mount Rainier. So I was able to live and enjoy the solitude, and I had my dog with me who had a feast chasing the ground squirrels around the mountaintop. There was no residence. It was a 14 by 14 foot square, and I lived and cooked in that, and my water was 1.5 miles straight down the mountain. And so I really had the opportunity to learn about high altitude mountains and living up there and keeping the windows clean and enduring the lightning storms by sitting on my little stool and frying the ants with a bent hanger. The flying ants were swarmed up there once, and I must have fried 1,000 of them one evening during a lightning storm. Anyhow, that perked my interest in forestry, but I wasn't thinking of a career yet. Then I went to Washington State, and fraternity brother mentioned it, and by that time the district ranger had kind of made me his boy Friday for all these special projects down on the district. I was doing special use inspections and particularly going in and snooping for him, because he was recognized and I wouldn't be. He wanted me to go in and see what was going on at some of these pseudo mining claims where people were building cabins, and at that time tote goats were kind of a new thing, a mountain bike, and those were not allowed on the wilderness areas, and they were going out there, and so the district ranger kind of asked me to go out there and see what you can find, and if it's safe, just destroy the thing, throw key pieces away, spark plugs and starting ropes, and just make it difficult. He says, but don't get caught. It was, sorry, he's long gone. I'm not getting him in trouble. But then back at Washington State, I enrolled in forestry when I had senior hours, and the department chair was a very senior member of the faculty. The dendrology prof was a senior member that was lots of fun, and I had always excelled at things with memory, and dendrology was a kick in the pants, and I aced that and had a great time, and really got embedded into the program in forestry at that time. Got my degree, and during that final year, I was assured I had a job with the Forest Service, but forewarned by the district ranger that I was going to have to be a junior forester, and I was going to have to put in some time on a timber crew, cruising and selling timber, marking timber, and I did not look forward to that at all, because I viewed that as kind of like feeding the chickens every morning. And I was more interested in the variety of activities that were taking place in the forest. And I was offered a job by a fraternity brother's father was the owner of Columbia Plywood, and I was offered a job with Columbia Plywood that would have necessitated becoming an industrial forester and becoming familiar with the industrial process, and that sounded a little bit repetitive and boring to me. So I jumped at the chance when George Grogan from CDF came north to Pullman and was holding interviews, and I interviewed and then quickly was offered a position in Fresno and hired on in May of 1964 as a Forestry Graduate Trainee, and had a delightful time with first assignment was to the senior staff in fire prevention law enforcement, and I spent a month plus just wandering around this District 4 on law enforcement and fire prevention issues in June of 1964. And then I was assigned to the Millerton Fire Station to become a fire crew member. Well, I thought I had seen lots of fire in the Pacific Northwest, but I hit Fresno, and they weren't just little fires you put out with dirt. You needed water, and the engines, the old Rio fire truck, and the brand new Chevy #1 Heavy. We had a ball. I really enjoyed that time. I was kind of viewed as somebody that was not exactly, didn't fit the mold of a firefighter. The previous trainees had been sent there, and they had not been able to do the job, or didn't do the job. I'm not sure, but I quick like was kind of absorbed into the fire protection side of CDF, and the district ranger and the station foreman, we had a ball. I mean, I learned progressive hose lay and ripped at least 5 pair of pants on barbed wire fences while I was learning the process of a progressive hose lay, and proceeded to then move on to other staff officers in the district office, learning what they were doing and accompanying them, my instructions from Don Knowlton, the district chief, and the assistant deputy, Howard Moore, or you go wherever your staff officer goes and take part in everything they do. So that involves some personnel activities and law enforcement, as I mentioned. Lots of traveling from sunup to sundown, and it was summertime in Fresno, and it was hotter than the bejeebies. And my wife and young son were there in Fresno, and it was not easy for them. But I was gone. I mean, it wasn't 5 days a week. I earned CTO like it was. I mean, I had by the time Christmas time came, I had enough compensating time off that I took 2.5 weeks. We drove north for Christmas with our families in Washington. The Forestry Graduate Trainee was restricted to new employees that had a degree in forest management. And it was a 1-year assignment, and if you successfully passed probation review of each staff officer, in my case, that I was assigned to, then I was promoted to junior forester, which was somewhat the level of a station captain in salary. It was still much higher than what I would have been making as a forester with the U.S. Forest Service at 400. I think I started at $486 a month, and I felt like I was in tall cotton. I had some bills to pay off from getting through college, but we were able to do that and move on to the junior forester after the 1 year as a trainee, and then as a junior forester I was assigned to, first off, the Los Banos Forest Fire Station, working with Rex Griggs, who later became chief in Southern California, but it was assistant ranger then. And maybe I shouldn't talk too much about, but I learned the technique of misidentifying what purchases were being made and how they were being paid. I mean, we bought food that was not food and he bought and it had a genuine air conditioner in his office in this little Quonset hut that he had for a station office in Los Banos that he and the splitting of SPOs had paid for. I lived there on the station till he went south, and that was in early 65. He promoted into the fire prevention law enforcement staff in Southern California, and then Stan McDonald came in as his replacement. And I was kind of the mentor to introduce him to the district, which was full of the San Luis Project, the California Water Project. And there were miles and miles of freeway being constructed and the tremendous equipment in and around the dam that needed to be inspected. So I had some involvement on all of that. And it was lots of time away from the station, and there was very, very little fire control because all the vegetation had been removed and it was nothing but dirt, and very, very little precipitation. In the back country, the grass was maybe an inch tall at that particular summer. So then late in that year, I was asked to run some studies under the standards for relocating the Los Banos station from the edge of Los Banos up somewhere probably into the project area of the San Luis Reservoir. So I got in my little fire truck from Los Banos, and I did time studies. How far could I go in 30 minutes? How far could I go in an hour? And I think I went clear out to 2 hours. So I was driving this little fire truck out into Monterey Bay and that area, and keeping notes as to where anyhow I filled out all this report, and where the station should be. And my recommendation on this thing was It ended up being not too far removed from where it actually is today, but on the opposite side of the freeway. The junior forester time at Los Banos was a real kick, and because I really didn't have a boss for a time, and I wasn't very successful at inspiring firefighters, but I remember using one guy who kept acting up, and I had him go wheelbarrow big boulders from the backyard to the front yard, and then decide to move them back. And he didn't like it, and I felt like I was all powerful, kind of dumb. But anyhow, I was then later moved into Madera headquarters as the assistant to Mac McCarty in the Schedule A activities in Madera County, which was just a one-horse operation with, I think there were 6. This was in the early summer of 65, early summer of 1965. And there were it was all agricultural land with stubble fields and orchards, and we had just fires breaking out all over the county, and the policy for the ranger in charge and the associate was that there would be an administrative staff on every fire to report on conditions, because there were only single drivers in each station, so they were responding alone most times without any volunteer support to take care of whatever was burning. And so then Mac McCarty, the assistant ranger in charge of the Schedule A program, ended up taking 2 weeks to go visit family in the Midwest because of illness, health issues. And the ranger said, "You're in charge, Dale. You keep track of what's going on with these fires." So I was given the foreman's pickup it had all the Code 3 equipment, and I was running one end of that county to another on fires, and some of them were nuisance, but others were rather spectacular. A hay barn that burned up I don't know how many 100 tons of hay, and another was to a dairy farm up near I forget the name of the town, where the farmer had hooked up LPG tank to his water lines to clean them out and didn't tell his wife, and anyhow ended up exploding their home and burning her severely from the waist down, because the gas had come out into the house, the residence. And it was an eye-opener. Nobody ended up dying, but there was medical issues to deal with. And then there were some of the stations, there was rather poor area where fire trucks were falling into cesspools, and just one issue after another. It was fun, but anyhow. That assignment finished up when Mac came back from vacation. But before I was released and sent to Squaw Valley Station in Fresno County, there was a fire had occurred up in Coarse Gold, and I was sent up there with him to investigate this fire. And it appeared to be arson, because it was a business that had closed, and then this building caught fire, and I was kind of the trainee, but I'd been with Dick Ford and Walt Bolster learning how to trace fire patterns, and they had been involved in some of the cases that they had developed on arson cases in Madera County. And Mac McCarty was on his hands and knees crawling under this building with a snifter to detect whether there was hydrocarbons under this building. And the local hound dog came up and lifted its leg on the backside of Mac McCarty, and I thought I would just die laughing. He was kind of instantly mad, but then he joined in. We had a kick with our Coarse Gold investigation. Then, as junior forester, I was sent to Squaw Valley, to be the station foreman then, captain, to be in charge. This was on Highway 180 east of Fresno up towards Squaw Kings Canyon National Park. And I was alerted to report there, and I think it was a Monday morning. It could have been any day of the week. But I drove up there and got there prior to the planned shift change at about 7:30 in the morning. And I drove into the station in my trainee pickup, little Dodge pickup, and parked it somewhere out of sight and out of the way. And there wasn't a soul moving. And I walked into the barracks, and here everybody was in bed. And I turned around, checked the engine, and it was spotless, shiny, clean. It hadn't been out. There hadn't been any fire activity, I deduced. So I started shaking the first bunk. I said, "What's going on here?" And it was the district ranger. And he was sleeping in the barracks because he'd had a little too much to drink to go home to his wife, as it turned out. And anyhow, the crew was all taking advantage of the opportunity to sleep in. And I inherited that, and Ed Young was the assistant ranger. He was a real fireman. He really was, and I learned a lot from him. He turned me loose with a little Jeep that he had, one of those war surplus things that CDF had back in the this is in spring of '66. And he wanted me to learn the county, and I drove all the counties, and that ranger district, which included Sand Creek Station, and that station was there, in my judgment, solely to protect the ranch of Cecil Metcalf, who was a recently retired deputy chief, or deputy for CDF. And the guys there at the station they rarely went anywhere. They had a little tiny light engine and a Quonset hut. And anyhow, we had some structure fires and very few wildfires. Meanwhile, I had taken the promotional exam for assistant ranger and for Forester 1, because as a junior forester, I was eligible. And I came out on top of both lists, in the top three, which meant I was reachable. Well, I soon passed the word on that I didn't want to be a forester. I wanted to go to the fire side of the organization because it had much more variety of activities. And I was soon contacted by, I forget who, I think it was Mel Pomponio in Sacramento, that I could have my choice of positions. There was an opening in Oric and Humboldt County, and there was one in Nevada City in Nevada County. Plus there were some in Southern California if I wanted to go that way. And I said, I don't care to go to Southern California. I never was an urban lover. And so I took the Nevada City job without going up or even seeing the facility. And July 4th of 1966, I was told that I should report to Sacramento, to the old District 3 headquarters, that George Phibbs wanted to talk to me. So I arrived there with my trainee pickup on July 5th, and I spent the afternoon with George Phibbs, had a delightful time just chasing geese and war stories and just what I had done and what he had done. And then the next morning was told to report to Nevada City. Well, they had been advised that I was coming, but there was no timetable. Well, meanwhile, they had been out chasing fires, and as I went north on Highway 49 from Auburn. Here was one of the fires that they had on the 4th of July that was not important what the cause was, but they had called in for an air tanker, and the air tanker had dropped his retardant load. Deep pink dye, it had plastered the front of a new home, sitting just up the hill off of Highway 49. The whole front of the house was colored in pink, and obviously driving by it had gone inside. And I arrived at the station, and there was lots of hubbub about many things, I'm sure, but I later found out that was the primary issue. They were trying to placate a homeowner that had his house painted. I arrived, and as the new assistant ranger was given the Shady Creek district, which had been held by an old-timer that had passed from heart problems. And the headquarters was Shady Creek Station, which was just off Highway 49, just south of North San Juan on the road up to Columbia Hill. There's a secondary station at Columbia Hill, was also a two-truck station that was right on the pay boundary with the U.S. Forest Service. My early introduction to the responsibilities of being the district ranger for a field unit in Nevada County was, on reflection back, as most entertaining. The associate ranger promptly took me out to the air base at Grass Valley, put me in a little Cessna 182, and we flew my ranger district. And I hadn't been anywhere on the ground other than Nevada City Station, which was headquarters. And I had all of these features pointed out to me that were going to become my responsibility for not only fire protection, but fire law, the LE 38 inspections, and all forest practice activities. The ranger in charge, Ted Waddell, was very, very stern about, you do not let district staff do any of your responsibility. You take care of the forest practice, the sick tree calls, and working within the community. So it was really kind of ideal, but my introduction from the air, I had no way to knit things together. I was making notes and trying to keep north and south in respect to the community. And then he took me out on one of the recent fires. This was the next day. It was a fire that was out near where he lived, out on Newtown Road, and it was just a nuisance fire, but it had gotten into some second growth timber with lots of manzanita, and there was a residence nearby. It had been an escape from an incinerator, and they had burned some plastic water lines that were, I think, were part of an irrigation system for a garden of some sort. But we then spent 2 hours digging ditches to route this water to hot spots on this fire to make sure that the fire stayed out, it didn't escape. And but then I was turned loose, and I was able to just, my assigned CDF pickup, I became 3312, and I was free to just roam my district to learn up from down and where people were, was introduced to numerous fire chiefs and personnel from the volunteer fire departments. And we, as Schedule B, responded to all fires reported in Nevada County. If it was a structure fire, we were second fiddle to the fire district. But if it has escaped from a structure and was in the wildland, we were in charge. So I was expected to become a Schedule A person and also a Schedule B ranger in charge of all the activities of the two stations. my upcountry station at Columbia Hill was kind of cold up there, not too many fires, and the Shady Creek Station was used extensively for cover of Nevada City. And so, and the district ranger in Nevada City was an old-time horseback assistant ranger, Willard Wasilski. What a gem he was. But he would hit a fire and he would disappear with his cal tool and he would be putting out fire. He didn't stay by his radio to tell the dispatch what was going on and what was needed. And that was very frustrating to the dispatch and to Ted Waddell and in the office. They wanted reports of conditions and whether more crews were needed or trucks or what was happening. So I guess my inclination was to let them know what was going on, and that was what was wanted. So I became kind of the preferred fire person for Nevada County. My district headed down into right to the county line of Yuba County, and there was a Smartville station, had its own assistant ranger. So he would cover the initial attack on those, but the ranger wanted me to cover all that stuff. And I had little town of French Corral and what's now a state park at the covered bridge at Bridgeport was the bridge for transportation in the county. And during my first year at 66, we became the target of the Haight-Ashbury moving to the foothills. And my boss was terribly concerned that all of these people were arriving and moving out into the BLM land, taking over residency in abandoned shacks and mine shacks and tunnels and whatever, living off the grid. And he wanted me, and that became my primary responsibility, fire prevention education, and issue them campfire permits so that they know what to do and how to do it. Well, the Haight-Ashbury, when they hit the mountains, they kind of lost their what I had understood as the social behavior characteristics of society. And I was inundated by naked men and women every day that I walked that canyon. And it was, I mean, I think I almost became kind of a magnet for the recent runaways that were up there, that were wanting to experiment. Well, they were soon undressed and told to come go get a campfire permit as I would make an appearance. And it was sad, but it was kind of like, oh my goodness. And I'd go back and tell my boss and what the day was like. And the sheriff's office became interested. The district attorney was very concerned about the activities of cultivation of marijuana that was the talk was coming that it was going to happen. And through the first 3 years there as district ranger, the bulk of my time was spent doing that. If I wasn't out checking on a logging operation, which was the other part of my job that was active. The forest practice inspection load was moderate, but there were just all kinds of Jippo logger outfits that were operating and had successfully been able to go in and get the logs that they wanted and vamoose. And under the original Forest Practice Act, they only had to file a notice of operation, and I soon deferred that they were filing that notice after they got caught or at the time that they were going out to haul in the first log. So I was hitting most of these operations that were noticed with a CDF form after it had been done and gone. There weren't too many issues because there was a lot split ordinance in Nevada County, so there was lots of logging of individual lots, but it was mostly on the developable land. It wasn't a lot of watercourse activities. But then in late, I think it was 68, there was a timber operation up near Shady Creek on this landowner's land by one of the Jippo loggers that just scattered all over this place in manzanita and Scotch broom and collected all of the timber and vamoosed without any water breaks. Well, I kind of took that as an offense and filed what was then notice of violation. And it proceeded over the next, I don't know, year and a half, that I was directed to go back out and see if they'd cleaned it up yet. And this was coming from the district office. Herman Meyer was the forester in charge in the District 3 office. And Ted Waddell wanted me to push it, and there was the ability under that Forest Practice Act to go in and correct actions. Well, that had never been done, and he wanted that done. He wanted us to go out and put in the water bars. Well, Herman Myers was kind of a fuddy-duddy, and he wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to get in trouble. And so I made endless inspections, and ultimately involved law enforcement from Sacramento and Tobar Vola and his deputy, I forget his name now, Earl Seacrest. I took multiple trips out there onto the ground. This was a 240-acre piece of ground that was primarily manzanita and Scotch broom, and it was all DG, so it was eroding pretty significantly, and no water bars, so it was just running on down the hill and the mountain into Highway 49 or into Shady Creek. Ultimately ended up in the AG's office, making sure that the case was iron tight, and I took Dean Bennett and Bob Connett, I think was his name, the deputy AG, the only attorney CDF had at the time, out on an inspection, and they concurred. So we filed the notice on the property that we were going to correct the violations. And it took us all of about 2.5 hours with a CDF D6 on both sides of Highway 49. And I don't know if we ever did get our money. It wasn't that significant, but it was just much more paperwork than there was cash return. The other part of the job was my boss, Ted Waddell, had gotten himself appointed to the County Planning Commission. So he was a member of the local government reviewing multiple developments and dealing with the lot splits, which was an issue because there were no road or access requirements. There were all kinds of lot splits with flagpole lots where a driveway would be the access back into a steep hillside for someone was going to be building a house. So he was attempting to deal with it at the administrative level, and he assigned me the responsibility to review all development plans that were submitted to Nevada County. And the lot splits were one thing, but then Boise Cascade started submitting plans for Lake of the Pines, and the Alta Sierra was developing unit by unit, and the landowners were proposing roads and showing lots and lots of flagpole lots with very poor access. so I ended up writing many reviews to the Planning Commission, the Planning Department, and ultimately I started including some comments about the impact upon the forest cover when it was in the forested area. And Alta Sierra proceeded. Ultimately, I think I recommended some of these larger lots, far removed from any water, have a cistern for fire water supply. But most of the rest of the development in Alta Sierra had an in-ground hydrant system. Lake of the Pines and Lake Wildwood likewise. But it was an arduous process going unit by unit, reviewing the specifics of where the roads were going to be and trying to visualize that out on the ground to relate to the planning process and approval at county. That raised my visibility with the U.S. Forest Service, and in addition to other promotional positions that began coming in, because by then I was on the reachable on the Ranger 2 and the Forester 2 list. This is in the mid 70s, approaching up into 1974. I had rejected several job offers in conservation camps and in ranger units in Southern California because my son was out of control and ruling and abusing his teachers in school, and I wasn't around. I was working 7 days a week. So I opted that I did not want to go to Southern California. I needed to be a little closer to an environment where I could be an active member of the community. And I was attended many fire district meetings. I ended up being the chairman of the church council at the Lutheran Church in Grass Valley, and I had one thing after another, and I didn't want to leave that. But then the Forest Service came through with this proposal with funding, and Fred Frank and Larry Ritchie and Lou Moran and Francis Raymond all personally contacted me and said they thought I should take this position. It was going to be, it was an unusual position. It would affect land use throughout the state. And this was late in the Ronald Reagan administration. And so I accepted this position, and it was as a Forester 2, which I acceded to taking the Forester because Ray B. Hunter was in charge at the time this was going on, and he was wanting to redesign all of CDF. He moved all the deputies around and changed things before he was ultimately shipped out and canned. But during that time, this offer came through, and I was on the Ranger 2 list and reachable, and that position had been approved as a Ranger 2 position, and I had said yes. Yeah, the Nevada County was broken up into multiple fire districts that were politically taxing entities that had volunteer leadership, and their tax base was first and foremost, in most cases, used to build a firehouse and social hall, and then they started buying fire equipment, and there wasn't any real consistent standard from fire district to fire district. But we as CDF were there and supported each of them as best we could, and they in turn sought to elect the CDF leadership to be the county representative for the fire services. Ted Waddell was I forget the title now, was the area representative spokesperson for fire service until he was moved under the Ray B. Hunter process, and we were consolidated with Placer County into Nevada-Yuba-Placer, and then the fire district selected me to be their spokesperson for the 2 years or so that I was there under the Nevada-Yuba-Placer Ranger Unit. Chaos could be created with the volunteer fire departments if they had a fire during one of their social functions, because alcohol was always served. And not each district, but several of the districts had unfortunate incidents, none causing any fatalities, despite preaching from lots of people like myself, where engines left the road or got tangled up with a tree somewhere along the route to the incident where they were responding. But it was a valuable tie to the community that pulled everybody together, and it was a rewarding social experience to get to know multiple families in the area. The position was in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, primarily to address the natural resource impacts of land development and in the local government areas, as well as the fire protection necessity to be addressed. I hit the office as the only civil service employee in an office that was entirely exempt. And that in and of itself was a wide awakening, because I had not ever considered taking a politically expedient job. But here were people that were all surrounding me that were in it strictly to further increase their visibility and their salary and their income. That was in 1974. I can't remember the date, the month, but in this office there was a former deputy director of the Department of Parks and Recreation that had been deposed in a fashion similar to what the CDF, Chuck Fairbanks, and all of the regional district deputies had been shuffled around by Ray B. Hunter, while the same thing happened in state parks. Well, he and I hit it off well. He was on the payroll as an exempt appointee at that salary rate, because of, I don't understand the civil service. He was CEA, and but anyhow, I spent the bulk of my first 6 months in that position, landscaping my house at home, because I had 6 months of CTO that had accumulated, and they wanted me to clean that up. The system wanted me to clean that up, and I had a task to accomplish. So I didn't spend a lot of time in the office, but the election of, I guess it was the election of 1974 when Jerry Brown was elected, I was back in the office pretty shortly after that. And by then I'd been moved from one little compact office dealing with CEQA into a much larger office that had 2 secretaries and then an ancillary office off on one side where I was located with one of these career climbers that was on an exempt appointment. And then across the way was a local government guy that was politically appointed, California Environmental Quality Act. And I was tasked with kind of just reviewing them as the documents were submitted. And I guess that was maybe the beginning of my cynical view of state government, because there was so much pandering and redundancy from one EIR to the next. It was just, I mean, anyhow, I've kind of voiced it quietly among the office and began showing documents where the same storylines were given for completely different projects, almost verbatim. And anyhow, I was just kind of priding myself on being a nitpicker, I guess, which I guess I've always been. One afternoon, I was on the telephone talking to someone, and all of a sudden, here came the lights and television cameras of the local news media, and Governor Jerry Brown was in my face. And he said, "Oh, you're not the one we're after." And he went across the outer office to the other side and threw documents down that he was carrying and fired this guy on the spot, on camera, for whatever. He had civil service rights as a junior staff analyst, and he had moved on up to a significant level within the Reagan administration. But that was my introduction to Jerry Brown. And he didn't talk to me. He didn't stay around. I mean, it was just kind of the political process, what happens. Jerry Brown came on board as governor, and I was in the office and watched the mayhem of people coming and going. And there really wasn't any chance, even under Jerry Brown, of there being a state land use plan, which was kind of what the Forest Service wanted. Meanwhile, I was going to all these senior staff meetings in San Francisco with the U.S. Forest Service, Region 5, where all the forest supervisors from the region were present, and they were discussing all of their issues, and I was there to just offer insight at the Forest Service invitation. And it was a world beyond me. It was federal bureaucracy up to my eyebrows, and I guess I probably was a little bit cynical and side conversations. I didn't make a fuss in any of the meetings, but Bob Lancaster, who was then the supervisor on the Los Padres, kind of took me under his wing, as did the supervisor of the Stanislaus National Forest, whose name I can't recall. And we just hashed the rare wilderness, rare 2 studies, and that was the big issue. And I just kind of endured. I came back after several months of that and just made the recommendation to Fred Frank and Larry Ritchie that my time in OPR really wasn't producing much of any benefit for CDF. I was having fun. There were many personalities that I got to know better than I really needed to know. And I had lots of fun lunches with political important people. And I was pulled back then into the downtown office of CDF. Okay, after leaving OPR, because there wasn't much going on of any benefit to CDF, I was initially assigned to help out in the forest practice activities, and reviewing during the transition from the original Forest Practice Act and the Zeeberg-Nedgedly, there was very little staff, but I was there shuffling, trying to figure out who was doing what out on the ground in the way of timber harvest. And that was quite frustrating because there were no requirements upon the foresters or the timber operators, loggers, or the landowners to pull things together. And I became not full-time, but I was directed to go to meetings in Zeeberg's office and Vic Fazio was his principal consultant at that time, and Nedgedly's staff, who I don't recall the names, but just in the development of the legislation, and then the beginning phases working with the Board of Forestry on regulation. It was just a swimming time for me. Initially, I was gonna be working in forest practice, and I reviewed some of the processes and of the original Forest Practice Act, but the Bayside thing had kind of squashed all of that stuff, and we were in the Zeeberg-Nedgedly negotiation legislation phase. The Bayside is when the courts found that the Forest Practice Act was not valid. The industry was in the driver's seat, and they were writing the rules for themselves, and that was the act where I had learned how to make a forest practice inspection on, and I had the forest practice little rules book that I carried around like a Bible, and I'd had that corrective action that was completed. Then the courts dumped the whole program. Well, that meant the staff in Sacramento, I guess, were not able to travel. They didn't have fun. I don't know what happened, but I received instructions to go up into the Sierras, into Sierra County, and inspect an activity that had the land ownership had been political operatives of the Republican Party. And that included Ronald Reagan, who was then governor, and his staff. The land had been purchased, and then it was parceled out. It was split up, and these parcels were sold to people of means, but they didn't read their sale contract. It became apparent very clearly because they relinquished all timber rights, and the timber owners decided they wanted to recoup their value by a certain date when they lost their timber rights. So they hired Robinson Timber from Nevada City to go up and harvest. There was no Forest Practice Act, so I was instructed to just go up and see what I could accomplish and let everybody know what was going on in forest practice inspection reports. Well, this was in a high elevation area above Jackson Meadows Reservoir on a stream that had one of the few populations of the Lahontan cutthroat trout. It was a perched watershed that the fish were not able to migrate back up into it, so it was uncontaminated. None of the Fish and Game planning of brown trout or rainbow trout had been able to access into this creek, and I don't remember the name of that creek, but it was all old growth red fir. I mean, big red fir, open alpine meadows, beautiful, beautiful country. And before my arrival, the landowners that had bought these parcels became aware that they did not own the timber, and that it was going to be logged. Well, they were given the opportunity by the timber owners to buy the stumpage on the stump if they didn't want it to be logged. And they didn't have any idea what the value was of the stumpage, and neither do I, nor did I then. But there were multiple cruises with every red fir looked like a I don't know, a maypole or something. It had multiple color, had every color possible paint on it from different cruises by different individuals at different points in time. And the landowners some of them were interested in buying the timber, and others had said, no, you log what you got to take, and then we'll take what's left. And so I was inspecting the timber harvest. And it was all done by the Robinson Timber had their own foresters, and I'm sure they were the ones that had done a lot of the cruising, but I'm not sure. I wasn't involved. The areas that had been logged were pretty slicked off because most of the timber was old growth, big stuff. Though there was one meadow in the midst of all of this where the creek flowed through that was full of these Lahontan cutthroat trout that were very visible. In places you could jump across the creek. It was deep, it was in a grassy meadow, but there were all kinds of dead trees, snags that had obviously too much water and lack of conditions for good growth. So there were these buckskin snags all along this waterway. And I was concerned about what would happen if those snags were put on the ground without regard for this watercourse, because they were all within reach of this stream that was full of these cutthroat trout. But I could not get the local fish and game biologist or his supervisor to even dare to come out and enter into this fray to make a decision. So I conferred with the fire folks, is this really an issue that we should be concerned about? And yes, from Forest Service and CDF people that I talked to. So I gave the instructions to fell the snags and to bridge the creek, not to drop them into the creek, or drop them away from the creek if they could. And it created a jackstraw mess but I went out and inspected, and there were no snags in the creek. But in the process of that final inspection, I slipped on one of those buckskin logs and fell about 7 foot. There comes Mr. Turkey. I fell in the logs and I jammed a knee, and it just immediately was swollen and it was sore. And here I was 50 miles from civilization. No, it wasn't quite 50. Anyhow, I hobbled my way back to my pickup, and I drove down to my Columbia Hill station through Graniteville, which is an all rocky, dusty, dirty road from this. And it happened that the new ranger in charge for Nevada-Yuba Placer, Mike Brock, was at the Columbia Hill station as I drove in. He was aware that what I was doing, and he was very, very concerned. He knew I was up there that day to check on these snags, this snag issue. And he didn't like the political scrutiny. But anyhow, I had hurt my knee, and so he was assured that I was going to be able to get to the dock, and it was just a sprain, and it healed. But Fish and Game never did participate in that Lahontan cutthroat trout, to my knowledge. This Lahontan cutthroat trout creek had flowed through this 260 acre parcel of old growth red fir. It was purchased by, among other Republicans, Ronald Reagan. There was a group of them that I don't recall the names. And those individuals sold parcels to other more environmentally concerned folks in the Bay Area, and primarily San Francisco, but there was one owner in Los Angeles that owned the land but did not own the timber until the passage of time, which was several years for the original landowners that did the lot split to harvest the timber. Well, they were harvesting the timber without a Forest Practice Act, and that's when I was sent in to. During that time, I was the Redwood National Park issue had come up. In '68, the original taking had occurred. that formed the Wierman, and that had caused chaos in the North Coast with the ability of the industrial landowners to log in the vicinity of Redwood National Park and the Wierman. And there were lots of adversarial back and forths and issues that I had not been involved with. But for some reason, I guess maybe it was because Lou Moran had been a former ranger in charge in Nevada County, and I had made certain that he was invited to come up to our end of fire season parties, which were quite jovial activities. And he brought along staff like Melvin Pomponio and Pete Peterson that also enjoyed reflecting on days gone past. Lou called me into his office one afternoon and told me that the Board of Forestry is meeting this afternoon over at the convention center, and I want you to come over there. I'm going to assign you to be the CDF staff on the issues of Redwood National Park. And I almost drowned as a kid in Redwood and Prairie Creek, Red Park with my folks, and we were camping on one of our many trips in the woods. But I knew only what I had studied very tentatively while I was going to school about the redwood forest type. But I was to be the person to represent the director, in dealing with the state parks and state fish and game and the federal and the National Park Service. CDF and Lou Moran was very concerned about the impact upon the operation of the agency in and around the new Redwood National Park and the Wierman that had been created in 1968. And the regulations of the Forest Practice Act had been attempted to address it, but it wasn't near to the state of bureaucracy that we have today. He wanted somebody dedicated to the issues of the park to address and work with the Resources Agency staff and Congress in Washington, D.C. Philip Burton was the congressman that was carrying legislation to expand the park, and he had all kinds of support from the Sierra Club and had relied upon one of their members as a forester and was receiving some kind of faulty thought process information. Anyhow, leading up to this meeting with Lou, I had been asked to read and review from agency an academic report on Emerald Creek, and I don't remember what the title of the issue was, but it was one of the professors at Humboldt State, and I don't remember his name, but he was an old fogey that was infamous for his reloscope, and I kind of shot holes and raised questions, and Claire Diedrich, who was Resources Secretary, apparently thought that was wonderful. And Lou Moran then said I was going to be the person for CDF on Redwood National Park issues, and I was go to the Board of Forestry and take in this. So I started assimilating information on Redwood Park issues at that point, without really knowing what I was getting into. But I took it as the assignment, and I started reviewing all of these regulations and the geography of redwood ecosystem, and by the let's see, that was in 1976, I believe. Claire Diedrich was agency secretary. Lou Moran was director of the Department of Forestry by then, not conservation. And Larry Ritchie was the chief deputy. Maybe I'm confusing things here, but I was given free license to just get yourself up to speed of what's going on in Redwood National Park. So I started reviewing timber harvest plans that had been approved and those that were in process, and all the squabbles with the Water Quality Control Board and the national park people. And I spent, I don't remember now how many months I was, but and I suddenly became expected to value this land in dollars. And I had not been a very keen student of forest valuation while I was going to school, but I was able to lean on Bill McKillop, who helped me greatly and what to do, and I was able to articulate that it would help a great deal if we had access to the cruise from the 68 taking that was taken by Hammond Jensen Wallen, that had been sequestered and held in private. It was not available at all for us outside of the industry in the North Coast. As I was introduced to Phil Burton over the telephone, as I got deeper and deeper involved and had been up to the North Coast, driving the roads and looking at the activities, Burton, we spent hours on the telephone talking about just issues of Redwood National Park and how I was coming up with these values of these acres of these sub-drainages within Redwood Creek, and what the process was, and it was, I mean, I was amazed. Here I was talking to a congressman for hours on end. Well, it come to find out that the staff for Claire Diedrich, Taylor Miller and Gary Weatherford, who were involved in the administration, were equally amazed that I was holding his ear for this long. Well, it ended up I was involved in preparing documents, reviews for the California congressional delegation as Philip Burton was marking up the legislation to expand the park. And at one time, the Sierra Club had convinced him that he needed to take the full drainage of Redwood Creek. And I tried to keep my personal opinions out of this the whole time, because I felt like Redwood National Park was a sin, but it was my job to give him information. The evaluation process of each sub-drainage was a direct result of Claire's desire to present a document to Phil Burton and to the whole California delegation, an objective evaluation of what all of these sub-drainages contained. And then that led to multiple days flying in one aircraft or another with a CDF pilot or a Fish and Game pilot up to the North Coast when there was clear weather, photographing all of these sub-drainages and the conditions that they were in, from the mouth of Redwood Creek at Oric clear on up to the top where cattle were grazing. And we prepared a document that ended up being 1.5 inches thick, full of photographs and narrative that was written. I initially wrote draft documents, and Taylor Miller was the principal editor that put it in context that was politically sensitive, and And that was put together and sent to the congressional delegation. And then soon after, I was advised by Claire Diedrich that I was to go to Washington, D.C. and work with Philip Burton and his staff on the markup of the legislation. And another just mind-boggling experience to see how that system works from the inside, and the personalities and the aggressive, terrible demeanor that they make in public hearings, but then they back off and ask to amend their remarks for written comments that will be submitted. And so the written record is much, much different than the bombastic things that were being said in the open testimony and among these congressmen, calling each other scumbags and worse. It ended up, then markup was completed. During that process, Philip Burton wanted to come out, and he'd never been to Redwood National Park. He'd never been to any of the redwood parks in the North Coast. He'd been to the ones right down in his district in the Bay Area. So it became an issue. Well, even backing up further, there was concern that the tallest tree was going to be felled by the loggers. And so the National Park Service had armed rangers camped at the tall tree on the banks of Redwood Creek throughout that was the summer of 78, I guess. Ended up being up on the North Coast in anticipation of Phil Burton and his committee arriving. I was his principal consultant, Calif was up there. He and I had gotten to know each other because of my time in Washington, D.C. But Phil Burton came in, and we had a huge contingency. Lazios, there was some big community activity there, but Phil Burton wanted dinner at Lazios, and that place was vacated, and we occupied the major share of that and had this tremendous dinner that we were going up to see the tall tree. Well, we couldn't drive in there because Arcata Redwood, and by then I was persona non grata to Arcata Redwood, and not quite so severely by LPGP. Al Merrill was very supportive and recognized that I was doing what I was told to do by Lou Moran. And Lou had told me, if you have problems, just seek out Al Merrill. And that was the one stable contact that I had. But I really had no interaction with industry foresters at all during this time. But we flew into the tall tree in a California National Guard helicopter, and we were all outfitted with headphones so I could talk to Philip over the noise, and he had his document that we'd prepared that we'd sent to the California delegation, and pointing out the different drainages of that down into Redwood Creek and where the tall tree was. We landed on the banks of Redwood Creek at the tall tree, and the Park Service personnel were there in full, and Philip Burton, I shouldn't call him Phil, wanted to see the tall tree, and I pointed out to him as we walked over there that this was the tallest tree. Not sure that it still is, because the top is lying over here. It fell out, and this sign used to be on, I am told, 12-foot posts, but it is down now very close to the ground. So there's been a lot of alluvial deposition, and plus the top falling out. since it was measured. And we're here now, and we had a picnic lunch that had been, I don't know who ordered that, and it was delivered. We all ate at the base of the tall tree, sitting on the ground eating our lunches. And after completing lunch, Burton was frantic, running around, making sure he was not going to allow one piece of sandwich wrapper bag to be left. He personally was going to make sure. And it took Calif, his chief consultant, and myself repeatedly to point out that, hey, there's rangers from the National Park Service over there with those rifles and shotguns that are going to pick up this and dispose of the trash and make sure that it's all removed. And so we left, and then back to more markup in Washington, D.C. Intervening, then there was a Senate tour that came in. The Senate Natural Resources Committee came out. I forget his name, from Kansas, was one of the members. And don't recall their names, but by that time I was advised that I was to stay off of Arcata Redwood land, or I would be arrested. A citizen's arrest warrant was in hand by the crews out on Arcata Redwood land. And so I was with them going out the K to K road through the Simpson, then now green what's it called? Green Diamond. But I peeled off and went up to the Bald Hill Station when we crossed Redwood Creek on the K to K. And the senators and everybody walked down to the tall tree, or down to a viewpoint above the tall tree. They saw these flyers that these loggers and side rods for Arcata Redwood had with my photograph and stuff, that they were serious. They didn't want me on their land, so I didn't go on their land. But we made it back after that tour, and then I was back in Washington for the markup. The bill was put to bed, but it was not submitted to House vote until the fall session, as I recall. During that time, there was much economic play. The redwood stumpage went from $50, $60 to hundreds of dollars, $1,000, and the fund that paid for the expansion of Redwood National Park was greatly inflated, and the ultimate the cruise had been provided to me through Phil Barton, so I was able to do some educated guesstimates of the value of what there was in board feet on each one of these sub drainages. So I was ultimately, then I put a dollar value, and of course when I was presented, all those subscript conditions were eliminated, and it was CDF says this land is worth and I rolled over and spent many a sleepless night wondering how I was going to justify that. But Redwood National Park, that came. Phil Burton was elated, and just a simple, maybe one of the other elements that where I was accepted by Phil Burton. We were early in the stage. We were down in his office in San Francisco, and there was, and I can't say his name, his daughter is now leading the Pacific Forest Trust, was the forester for the Sierra Club, and he had made some to-do apparently about the invalidity of the cruise because of the butt swell, or I just addressed that as the Hammond Jensen Wallen knew what they were doing, and the volume of the timber is as reported in the multiple volumes. I don't know where that report is gone, but Phil Burton sent me, I think it was 10 volumes of cruise reports from the original 1968 taking. And I was able to extract from that by geographic location of these different subdrainages. While we were on the ground, also as a side note, I took Phil Burton out onto the Cal Barrel Road, and to emphasize the point that the Park Service, when they took possession of this land, did not manage the forest, I pointed out the conditions on the Cal Barrel Road, where it was literally a stem count. I don't know what it was, but it was so close that there was no way that a small critter could crawl between the trees. I said, this land needs to be managed as a forest to develop a park, not just to be left to sit. And he took that, and there's provisions in the expansion of Redwood National Park that included direction to the Park Service that they were to manage the forest land to develop a park, not to just let it sit. The worm in Redwood National Park is the band of private land that suddenly at the stroke of midnight in 1968 became national park land of Redwood National Park. I don't recall the exact clearance, but it was from the center line of Redwood National Creek. I think it was 600 foot on either side of the creek, but I'm not sure of and it went upstream far enough to include the tall trees and the immediate subdrainage above what was then the tall tree on the Redwood Creek. Okay, after Redwood National Park issues were resolved and the bills were paid, and I took about 6 weeks vacation just to get reacquainted with my son and drove up the Pacific coast. I was reassigned back into forest practice, and there were regulations being developed and proposals of all kinds, and I was directly responsible for the registration of the timber operators and their licensing, or whatever it's properly called, and establishing a system to where it was done in a timely manner, and their checks were cashed immediately instead of after all the bureaucracy had sat on it for 6 months, because there had been an issue of checks bouncing or insufficient funds and operators all over the state. With that process, I evolved into more legislative activities and became somewhat involved with reviewing federal legislation dealing with the RPA and the Monongahela and the issues that were causing chaos within the Forest Service, and offering insight to Washington and through the region office and direct to Washington with what the state position would be on various proposals. And Fred Frank was very much involved then as well. But as the Forest Practices Act started solidifying, then there was the Chaparral Management Program and the Forest Resource Assessment Program legislation were moving forward. The administration of the government, of California government at that time, was supportive of the Chaparral Management Program, but they weren't in fact, they were opposed to a Forest Resource Assessment Program. There was some effort to support it and the board officer, Dean Cromwell, was in support of it, and Larry Ritchie was in support of it, and I became involved in helping create the foundation, and the legislation was ultimately passed and signed. Then I was assigned to help staff up and create the California Forest Resource Assessment Program. And the process of getting a director, Larry Ritchie had some opinions, and there were several names that were offered, and most of which said, "Oh no, I don't want to deal with that." But Wyckoff had been very active with the Forest Service in the development of the proposed Disney World and the Mineral King, and he was identified as a potential candidate. So I developed the IPA agreement with the Forest Service to hire Wyckoff as the first director of the FRAP. When the legislation passed, I created a memo for Larry's signature, and he signed it, and then he read it. And I had done it purposefully just kind of cynicism of government, but it was passed as the California Resource Assessment Program, as I proposed in this memo, and therefore it would be called crap. And he signed that thing, and I said, "Larry," anyhow, we readjusted, and it became FRAP, Forest Resource Assessment Program, and then it went on from there. FRAP was a direct response in an attempt to get resource data from the Forest Survey for California. The Forest Survey had evolved as a resource inventory nationally, but they would dismiss any statistically located plots that did not include commercial timber or forest species, and that excluded anything in California that was brush or hardwood, oak or live oak or whatever. And we wanted to gather data about the resource values on all the lands in California. And so it got to the point where it was just brainstorming mission after mission with Hank Box and how we could come about doing this, and we needed to have a land inventory basis, and the basic forest inventory of the USDA was we were hopeful of being able to adapt to a California model. We spent money. I had developed a relationship with NASA and their technology and we used the U-2 aircraft on assignment to photograph all the areas of California to create a mosaic photograph in support of this potential resource inventory. And the satellite imagery was tied into the U-2 imagery, and it became a very complex, massive mess. But we did our best and created what was going to be a report. And I was very sensitive to the deadline that was included in the legislation to get a report done, and it was not going to be on time. And I pushed and pushed, and there was just no way it was going to be accomplished. And I tangled myself with the administrative regulations of finance and contracts, and I was given sabbatical from the FRAP program, and I moved to Amador, El Dorado to help develop the chaparral management program. And from that position in Amador, El Dorado, I bought a motorcycle and I started commuting from Davis to Sutter Hill on a daily basis. And we developed lists of landowners of, I forget the size acreage, I think it was 10 acres or larger of forest land or potential forest land for Amador, El Dorado, Calaveras, Tuolumne, Alpine. I think that was it. Maybe we included Placer. But anyway, developed a land ownership map pattern and started making contacts to sell the VMP, the Chaparral Management Program, as well as CFIP, forest improvement, the grant money that we were getting out of the state forests, demonstration state forests. That just stumbled along, and I was doing forest practice, and American Forest Products was the primary landowner, and they apparently had not had a forest practice inspection that left a roadway. And that was not my method of operation. I started walking skid trails and beyond to see what was going on. And I discovered that there was a bit of unstable land in the Sierra Nevadas, and that there were mountains falling down. And that furthermore, the bulldozers didn't stop at water courses. They waded across water courses and up and down water courses, and water courses had been diverted into roadways, or roads became watersheds. It was a mess. And I started calling a spade, and did not make myself very happy at all with American Forest Products or the other Wetzelloviet in that country. And but I got people out on the ground from water quality and fish and game and our erosion studies, and it was well documented that things were awry and that things needed to change. I came back to Sacramento to let industry run their business then. And I finished out kind of my career as either chaparral management contract reviewer, approval, denial for the director's signature, and then evolved into the environmental protection position, where I finished my career on December 3rd of 1996. With many accusations of Wierman's rules instead of CEQA rules, and it was a tumultuous time. And I guess during that time I gradually just came to the realization that I was not going to make a difference in CDF. It was the politicians were calling the shots, and it wasn't necessarily what's best for the land or the people. I don't know that my perspective has broadened, I believe. Though since I retired, I made the commitment to myself that I was not going to become deeply involved in any of the natural resource issues, whether I could be an active participant or not. I wasn't going to participate and make life difficult for those that were left behind, that were trying to straighten out the bureaucracies. And it's the evolution of natural resource policy is discouraging to me at best. I would say my mentors throughout my career in forestry, it started out with the old horseback ranger, Spike Armstrong, on the Natchez Ranger District in Natchez, Washington. was the first one. My professors, they were all good mentors. They were academicians that didn't have a whole lot of recognition of what it was like to be a forester in California, I don't believe. Within CDF, for some reason, my strongest mentors were the guys that are all long gone. George Phibbs, Ted Waddell, Lou Moran, Jeff Snow, Paul Cox. Oh goodness, and I know I'm forgetting some. Dick Ford was not a forester, but he was a fire prevention guy that I relished the times that I had with him, crawling in the ashes as he was teaching me how to read the fire pattern. And then Claire Diedrich was very influential in my time and brushing with the politicians and trying to make sense of the nonsense. She was replaced while I was in Washington, D.C. at the final markup on the legislation. She called me at the wee hours of the morning to let me know, and that Huey Johnson was going to succeed her. She was going to the PUC. Jerry wanted somebody that was a little more flamboyant in the resources agency, I think was the text of her word to me. I returned to Sacramento and shortwith was summoned to give a meeting with a rundown of my experience and time in Washington, D.C. to Huey Johnson. By then, I knew all the staff in the office except Huey Johnson. I entered his room, and he had this huge redwood burl desk that he was perched behind, and his instructions to me were have a seat, and it was a hanging chair swinging by some kind of rope from the ceiling. And I said, "Sir, I don't do very good on that kind of stuff," and I just sat on the floor. He didn't particularly appreciate that I didn't like his perch that he had offered me, but it was a short meeting, and I didn't have much dealings with the resource agency after that. SAF became part of my life when I hit Fresno, way back when as a trainee, because on my arrival I got I think it was a telegram. I'm not sure if it was anyhow, I was advised by my professors at Washington State that my degree was from an accredited SAF institution, retroactive to include my class. And so I thought, whoa, that was just kind of a never land, because I had gone to Washington State to avoid taking calculus and taking the summers off to go to forestry camp that the University of Washington required, and I worked in the forests and from Washington State. My first SAF meeting that I recall was held on the floor of Yosemite National Park. The superintendent was the guest speaker, and I was really amazed that he announced that I don't remember the numbers, but the population within Yosemite National Park on that particular evening was greater than the population of Fresno. And it was, I mean, it just blew me away. And then he was detailing the efforts that they had to go through in the Park Service to remove trees. They had to do it in the dead of night, and they had to grind away all the stumps. And we had been back into the drive-through tree, or back in the Wawona Grove, and he detailed specifically when during that year that road was going to be closed because they were taking out some of the sugar pine, and incense cedar that were overtopping the big trees that were in there. They had to do their logging in secret. And then my promotion up into Nevada County after the junior forester was fire-centered, and I didn't do a whole lot with SAF until I hit Sacramento. And that's when I began realizing that there were quite a few quote-unquote foresters in Sacramento that were not members of SAF. And that kind of bothered me. And then it bothered me even further when this California Licensed Foresters Association came along after the Licensing Act, and they formed their own association separate from SAF and started kind of being antagonistic toward the Board of Forestry and their regulations, and in fact going to court to litigate different points that they're of their persuasion. So that inspired me to become a little more active in SAF. And the convention in San Francisco in 1992 is when I really dove in head first, full bore. And I'd never created an exhibit in my life, but I was tasked with creating an exhibit for CDF at the National Convention Society in San Francisco. The convention was a fun experience, but I was amazed at the response of the exhibit that I had put together. I was kind of given a free leash by Ken Delfino, and I felt that we needed to have something green growing around the exhibit, but it was not encouraged. Well, I just made a decision. I went ahead and wrote an SPO to rent a bunch of trees to put around the exhibit. Well, Richard Wilson had just been named director, and he liked the exhibit, and he said, I want that exhibit put together for the American Forest Convention in Los Angeles. So I modified it only slightly, and we put it up in what's the name of that old hotel in downtown Los Angeles. And it was a completely different audience, but it was a photograph of the personalities, not focused on individuals, but the programs of the department. And it was photographic display of people doing their job on fire and forests and nurseries and all the programs of CDF, including range improvement, which I've skipped over entirely. But I was a big burner in Nevada County, encouraged the ranchers up there to go burn bushes to get more grass for their cows. So I became involved with SAF, attending all of the state meetings and the board of directors meetings. And I guess ultimately I was asked to run for chair of NorCal. And I was I had not announced that I was retiring, but I had determined that I was going to leave the outfit. But I let my name be put in the hat. Dan Uplack succeeded me by a few votes, which was fine. But I then became much more involved in SAF activities within California, and the first convention there in San Francisco instilled in me a desire to get more involved, and I was put on the committee for, what do they call it, awards, and by Dave Smith, who was president of the SAF from Virginia Tech. And I served 2 years as committee member, and then the last year I was the committee chair and making recommendations for the different SAF awards that were the responsibility of the committee. It was the Awards and Recognition Committee for SAF nationally that we became involved with personalities scattered around the country, reviewing their nominations and making a selection and recommendation to what was then the Council of SAF. And I don't know how the process works now. Well, they should be very relevant, but it's been very discouraging to me that the system in California government and federal government does not require their foresters to be participating or at least attending SAF activities. There's no culture that seems to be pushing in that direction. It's the other direction. Everybody seems to become a union member, and that's the last, at least in my view, the last element that should be representing the public interest in California forests at any time. My involvement with SAF greatly increased after I retired, and I had been a regular attendee of the Tahoe Sacramento chapter activities throughout the 80s and 90s, as best my schedule would allow, and but I became much more involved after I retired and became involved nationally and continued attending the national conventions. Oh, that's conflict resolution was not one of my strong suits at any time. I was not a very productive participant in meetings where there was conflict. I did not shrink from expressing my thoughts on where they were in left field or out of line, and it was part of public service that I kind of rebelled against, being swallowing their line of BS. But I was at times a dues-paying member of the Sierra Club and the Nature Conservancy, but I let them know loud and clear when I dropped them, why I dropped them, that they were being irresponsible advocates for actions that were not in the public's best interest in the short term or the long term. And as a result, I kind of sit out in the corner sometimes. It's going to become probably even more tenuous with increasing regulations of every ilk about every activity that's going to take place and potentially cause some damage to something somewhere. Does not seem, from my perspective, to be a recognition of the value of a managed forest and the extraction of the resources to maintain those resources that are desired to be extracted from that piece of land. It doesn't have to be all timber, and it rarely can be all timber in California, even under the most stringent of regulatory scenarios. Whoa! It would have turkeys in the.
So what is, but it's a perfect world, which means you can have anything you want. I don't know. What would be your vision of an ideal forest?
Ideal forest.
Think about it.
Yeah, an ideal forest would be one that is open with intervals between the individual specimens of the standing forest that allows for all of the resources that are prevalent in that area, like turkeys, where as we speak, but and wolves in the terrain in the Rocky Mountains and throughout California, where they were once a part of the ecosystem. I think there's lots of room for inclusion without all the regulatory hyperboil that we take place and all the adversarial discussions. Not beyond discussions, just adversarial accusations in the world that we have today. SAF is got a strong place in my heart, and I've continued to support them financially. But there are other activities that have entered into my life, like Yellowstone National Park and that environment of the Northern Rockies, and the issues of government in Montana just frustrate me terribly, and they're dealing with bison and the gray wolves. But I have enjoyed much more time in the wildlands of Western North America than I did before I retired.